going to be a presentation about rocks.
No shot. No shot.
No way.
Okay, this is going to be a presentation about cellular respiration, one of the fundamental units of life. It's a fundamental process of life. So we're going to get into it. Oh, I guess I got to be next to the arrow. So when you think of cellular respiration, there's three things you mainly think of. You think of the cell, you think of breathing, and you think of energy. And I'm going to break down each step in this presentation. So the components of cellular respiration, you have oxygen, you have glucose, and you have ATP. These are the three most important components. The chemical formula is a redox reaction. You have oxidation occurring here from glucose to CO2, and you have reduction occurring over here where oxygen becomes H2O. We're going to go more into depth on each specific process that causes such a reaction. And all of this occurs in the mitochondria. So we're going to start with step one. This is glycolysis. So glycolysis is located in the cytoplasm, and essentially what glycolysis is glucose gets broken down into, it gets oxidized into pyruvate. So what you get from that reaction is glucose being broken down into pyruvate, but the main important things you get is ATP and NADH. Now you might be thinking, what is NADH? NADH is an electron carrier. And what that means is that it carries an electron. It gets reduced to carry an electron. And these electrons are vital in order to create the electron transfer chain, which generates even more ATP later on. So now we have pyruvate oxidation. So this is one of the less explained steps in cellular respiration because it's not that important in the AP Bio curriculum, so I'm not going to go too in depth. But the main important aspect is that this occurs in the mitochondrial matrix. The pyruvate enters the matrix and becomes acetyl-CoA. This is even more oxidized, and by oxidized, the electrons are pretty much leaving this sugar molecule. It keeps becoming smaller and smaller, and you keep getting NADH and CO2 as a byproduct from this reaction. Now in the Krebs cycle, continuing in the mitochondrial matrix, we have the Krebs cycle, where it's essentially a repeating cycle that cranks out CO2, ATP, and electron carriers like NADH and FADH2. So the main aspects of the Krebs cycle is oxaloacetate combines with acetyl-CoA enzyme and creates citric acid. This thing cranks through the entire cycle. It generates a bunch of CO2. It generates electron carriers, reducing electron carriers, and then eventually it restarts by combining with another acetyl-CoA enzyme. Now this is the most important aspect of cellular respiration, and it's also one of the more complex aspects, but I'm going to break it down. This graph seems like a lot, as Noah mentioned 2 periods ago, and it's true, it is a lot, but you can break this down into 2 major steps. The first one is the electron transfer chain. So the electron transfer chain is the most important aspect of cellular respiration. Essentially what you get from the electron transfer chain is all of those electron carriers that were reduced release electrons in this chain. So you get the electron carriers, you get the electron carriers and they pretty much send out their electrons through this chain. As the electrons are moving through this complex, what it does is it provides just enough energy to create a concentration gradient for hydrogen. So you get hydrogen coming into the inner membrane space, and that creates something called a charge, like a different charging. So one is like more positive than the other. So what that actually results in is one of the most important steps in cellular respiration, and that's chemiosmosis. Essentially, because of that difference in charge in the intermembrane space and the mitochondrial matrix, eventually, because of the difference in charge, that positive will want to come to that slightly less positive, pretty much you could call it a negative side. Those hydrogen ions will move up and into this thing called the ATP synthase, and when it does that, it kind of like cranks enough to pretty much generate ATP by cranking ADP and phosphorus together to create ATP. This generates the most amount of ATP in the cellular respiration cycle. So we can break down this complex diagram that I mentioned a few minutes ago, and you can see that all of the electrons pretty much go through this transport chain. It creates a concentration gradient, and that concentration gradient helps to formulate ATP. And through this presentation, let me continue. So this is just a diagram showcasing essentially how the energy levels are progressively decreasing because you're actually creating energy and reducing electron carriers. So you can see glucose is pretty high energy, and then at the end is pretty low energy because we pretty much took everything from it. And this is the final diagram of all that we discussed, a generalized model of pretty much everything. You can see glucose goes through glycolysis, it creates ATP and some electron carriers. It goes further into pyruvate oxidation, forming acetyl-CoA. That's vital for the Krebs cycle, which cranks out even more ATP and electron carriers. And finally, oxidative phosphorylation, which is essentially the electron transfer chain and chemiosmosis. So through this presentation, you finally understand just how and why the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. Thank you.